lots of good diversion out there, because otherwise we'd have to spend all our time dealing with the jackasses. Welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia. I'm Eric Edelman, counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, non-resident fellow at the Miller Center, and Bulwark contributor. And I'm joined by my partner in all things strategery, Elliot Cohen, professor emeritus of strategy at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and a contributing writer to The Atlantic. Elliot, how are you?
All things considered, pretty good. You know, I look out the window at my garden. I say, boy, it'd be much nicer if I put some effort into that. And I make good resolutions, which I have a feeling I won't follow through on, but at least I feel virtuous about the resolutions.
Well, you might have more time to spend in your garden, because you might want to stay off the streets of Washington, D.C. as they're being swept by FBI agents, federalized National Guard, and God knows who else that the president has put in the service of combating his, self-invented, DC crime wave.
Well, I think we effortlessly slide into the jackassery of the week, and there are two readings, I think, of what Trump has just done. One which is purely sinister, which is, okay, this is the first step. This is. Next thing you know, it's the jackboots and
desensitizing people to making a military do,
right.
Law enforcement.
But I think that's one version of it. The other version is this is just more random synapses triggering the completely impulsive acts which lead nowhere. So let's just take federalizing the National Guard of DC. Let us remember, first, the National Guard has no training in law enforcement, so there ain't a whole lot that
or dealing with mental illness, which they're going to be dealing with if they're trying to sweep up homeless people.
Right. And then the second thing is you cannot keep those people mobilized forever.
Right.
And so, this kind of peters out. This is gesture politics. And then I guess they're also putting some FBI folks on the streets. The FBI does not deal with street crime. They're not going to be particularly effective at any of this. And, this is more kind of posturing and bloviating and chest thumping, and it's dangerous. I mean, I don't dismiss it, but in a weird way, I've come to the view that one of the things that protects the republic from ultimate destruction by Trump, who is a very dangerous character in many ways, I fully concede that, is his chaotic nature. I mean, he just does one random thing after another as the mood seizes him.
Yeah.
But he can't really follow through.
Yeah, I guess the one thing I would say is, it may not be that random. I mean, it also seems to me to be of a piece with the flailing about he's been doing for a couple of weeks now to try and change the subject from the Jeffrey Epstein business, which it's impossible to do. In part because he's hoisting his own petard here, of course. He and his followers have been stoking these flames for years. And J.D. Vance, just over the weekend, I think compounded it all by saying, yeah, it's all Epstein is all Democrats, and all of Bill Clinton, they were all doing it, which of course is just going to fuel the fire for all the MAGAs to say, well, then release it. Let's go after those Democrats. Let's get the pitchforks out and start indicting them.
There's a very good piece in The Atlantic by Pete Wehner, who I think is always terrific.
Fantastic.
With Bob Beschel, which I think documents the extent to which, and they're looking at a lot of polling data, that, as you go through things, it's clear most Americans do not feel Trump has been making their lives better at all. They're making it worse. The tariff inflation effect is beginning to be felt. The unemployment is beginning to be felt. And, and they will lie and flail and, fire the head of Bureau of Labor Statistics. But reality, as you and I have also often discussed, in the conflict between your desires and reality always wins. And so I think that they will that will eventually happen. It's just, the amount of damage these guys are going to do. Well, we've begun talking about go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was just going to invite you. I mean, that we've already, had it because it's such a target rich environment. We just can't stick to one jackass thing these people have done.
Yeah. Well, as we were discussing before we went on the air, the point of the jackassery segment, I think, is not just to make fun of these people, which is a healthy thing to do of people who have tyrannical aspirations. But it reveals kind of their deeper pathologies and things which may not seem innocuous, but are not, dragging people off to torture chambers. So my candidate this week is Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, who really is unfortunately, our designated jackass, ordering the reestablishment of the Reconciliation Monument in Arlington Cemetery. For those who don't know, the Reconciliation Monument was passionately advocated by the Daughters of the Confederacy, probably the most reactionary organization you could find in the United States. Very much part of the lost cause. There were actually tremendous internal fights, apparently, because there were a couple of hundred Confederate soldiers.
Let's just stipulate, as lawyers would say, that lost cause mythology, because it was a myth.
Yeah. So it's this rehabilitation of the Confederacy and lies about it in the 1880s through the first part of the 20th century. There were actually internal fights, apparently, in the Daughters of the Confederacy about whether there were a couple of hundred Confederate soldiers who were buried in Arlington Cemetery who they wanted to move to the South so they wouldn't be in the same cemetery with Union soldiers. Arlington Cemetery, of course, had been planted in the backyard of Robert E. Lee's mansion by Montgomery Meigs, the quartermaster of the Union Army, very deliberately. And it had been done so that, as he said, Mrs. Lee is going to be looking at a field of Union graves. This was after Meigs's own son was killed by Mosby's Rangers in the Shenandoah Valley. But the Reconciliation Monument, which was dedicated by Woodrow Wilson in 1914 on Jefferson Davis's birthday, wrap your head around that one, is a monument by a very famous sculptor named Moses Ezekiel, who's quite talented. And it's a celebration of the Confederacy. There are sort of gestures to reconciliation and, that the war is over, but it includes some really egregious things on it, including, the caricatured black mammy bringing a baby to a Confederate soldier and a loyal slave following his master off to war. And it's really stomach turning stuff. And what's striking to me is that, Hegseth views this as American history, as, the truth of American history. Well, that's not the truth. It's a lie. This was treason. The war was about slavery. It wasn't about anything else. We should actually have my friend Ty Sedgley on, retired brigadier general, who was part of the renaming commission, whose work has been undone by Hegseth. And it's, this is ludicrous. I'm sure it'll be removed by some later administration and probably melted down as a result of this. But it's, it does tell you about this deeper pathology in which the Confederacy, which, again, I will say, that was about slavery. It was unquestionably about slavery, and it was about treason, which is what
it is about people taking up arms against the United States of America in violation of their oaths.
Absolutely. That this is somehow a good part of American history, and just shows you how powerful that myth remains even today, century and a half later.
Oh, poor me. And here I thought you were going to pick on Secretary Hegseth for having retweeted a video clip of the evangelical pastor whose church he's a part, who was calling for repeal of the 19th Amendment, so that women could no longer have the right to vote, and insisting that they be subordinate to their husbands, which created a lot of chatter in the Edelman household. I'm not sure about yours.
Well, no, but I was afraid to even bring it up.
Well, I have a more, unfortunately, a more serious form of jackassery. I mean, as you point out, this is clownishness, but it's clownishness that carries serious consequences in a lot of cases. And for me, as a professional diplomat for most of my adult life, the Steve Hegseth meeting with
Steve Witkoff, I think.
I'm sorry, Steve Witkoff.
I know one jackass blends into the
yeah, there's too many jackasses to keep track of. Steve Witkoff, the president's personal envoy for winning him the Nobel Peace Prize, who met with President Putin on Wednesday of last week, completely garbled the message he got from Putin, thinking he'd heard that Putin was open to making some concessions, when in fact all he was doing was reiterating the standing concessions he's been demanding of the Ukrainians. And on the basis of that, got Trump excited and got him to set up the summit meeting coming in Alaska, which many of Putin's supporters are, putting billboards up in Russia, saying Alaska's ours. We want it back. We were rooked out of the Alaskan by the, devious Americans. We want it back. So, couple of things about this. One, not the first time that Witkoff has screwed up. I mean, as you'll recall, and as we discussed, he had told the Iranians that, the American position was that they were free to continue to enrich uranium, when in fact that was not the position. And obviously that is still an issue that may have to, be worked out if there are negotiations with the Iranians, or it may have convinced the Iranians there's no point in negotiating with the Americans because Witkoff lies and tells you stuff that's not accurate. But he's had, I think now, this was his fifth meeting with Putin. He's, excluded any representative of the deep state, that is to say, anybody with subject matter expertise, knowledge of Russian, knowledge of the history and context and complications of the Russian-Ukrainian relationship in the war. For instance, including our former colleague Lynn Tracy, a very capable American diplomat who
extraordinarily capable,
who until recently was the U.S. ambassador to Russia. And so, of course, he cocked it up. Relied on. I don't know if he did this time, but in previous meetings, he's relied on the Russian interpreter, which is a classic mistake that no professional diplomat would ever make. So here we are. Luckily for us, the Europeans and the Ukrainians got together, including with Vice President Vance in the UK over the weekend, and have actually outlined a very straightforward and sensible kind of game plan for Trump to follow, which was conveyed to him by Finnish President Alex Stubb, who I think he was a graduate student when I was ambassador 26 years ago, which tells you something about, Finnish politics and, the youth of Finnish politicians.
Or about your advanced age, Eric.
Yeah, that too, I'm afraid. But he's like his predecessor, Alex Stubb is a very, very capable guy. One of the most capable, I think, leaders in Europe right now, as was his predecessor, Sauli Niinistö. Although former President Biden liked to take credit for expanding NATO in 2022 and 23, it was actually Sauli Niinistö who got Finland and Sweden to apply for NATO membership and worked out a lot of the kinks and the problems. It was really more his doing than Biden's. But Stubb was the one who Macron, Starmer, Merz, Maloney, Ursula von der Leyen, all kind of nominated to be the one to convey this European position to Trump in a phone call. And that was very smart because Stube has cultivated a very good relationship with Trump, mostly on the golf course. By the way, a great example of American soft power. I mean, President Stube played his college golf at Furman University, South Carolina, and was quite a good collegiate golfer, and obviously still pretty good. So, all in all, we can hope that, sort of this idiocy of Witkoff's can be undone by our European allies' influence. But, who knows what's going to happen in Alaska on Friday when he and Putin get together.
Yeah. I had a couple of thoughts about it. One was, I think the actual craft of diplomacy is something that most people, even people in the national security world, frequently don't get. The idea of being very precise about language, both what you communicate, what you put in an agreement, exactly what you're hearing from the other side, which is why interpreters are so critically important. That is central to the art of diplomacy, which is why him not having a note taker there, saying no, Mr. Envoy, this is actually what Putin said, and this is the precise Russian phrase, and what it meant is so critical. When it's necessary to be ambiguous, to be ambiguous. But this is why amateur envoys, although sometimes can be very successful, to be sure, often are disasters because they do have this impulse to say, okay, all you pinstripe cookie pushers get out of the way, and I'll do it my way. And maybe this is the way you do crooked real estate deals in New York or Florida, but it is absolutely not the way you want to handle relations with a real snake like Putin. So just to follow up on that theme, I mean, the concern I have obviously is, you put Putin, trained KGB, a Moscow-trained hood, as they say in the spy novels, in a room with Trump. That's concerning. That said, I am, my rule now on talking about Trump, which is I'm going to wait and see what he actually does. My gut tells me this is terrible. It is striking to me that I agree with you that the Europeans have taken a completely sensible line, and they've got, seem to have Zelensky aligned with them, which is good. And I think that gives them some force. I think it's going to turn out to be fortuitous that Vance, last seen being enormously proud of his hillbilly background and so on, who happens to spend his vacation swanning around the swankiest part of England, the Cotswolds. And then going off to Scotland was there. And so he's sitting there with the British foreign secretary, who may be terrible on other things, but is actually pretty good on this one, and has those folks around him. I don't know that this will turn into a catastrophe. I just, with all things Trump, I think you wait and see what they actually do and what comes of it. But is it good? No.
I think it was Charlie Sykes who said this is like Munich for idiots, but and let's hope it's not that. I mean, the idea of a Yalta 2.0 or a Munich 2.0, it's all too real. And of course, I think anybody with any sense immediately when they heard that Putin and Trump were going to be meeting in Alaska on the basis of this, garbled, botched meeting, just had that reaction.
I think that we should get on to happier topics. I think I've heard the Yalta metaphor used and the Munich metaphor used, and I think both are actually inappropriate. Munich, in a way, because it's unfair to Chamberlain.
I agree with that. Although there's certain similarities because there's
some similarities in that. But look, they had the experience of going through an absolutely horrific war 25 years before. But more importantly, there was no kind of third block out there, which you do have with Europe. And let's face it, Ukraine is not Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was not a country that had been fighting a heroic war for 3 years. And this is just an incredibly gutsy.
In that sense, it's more like Finland.
Yeah, it is more like Finland. so that's one thing. And Yalta, I don't think is right either, because there was actually nothing you could do about the occupation, to be realistic about it, to be about the Russian occupation of Poland. Poles hate it when I say that, but FDR was not going to order the United States Army to go after the Red Army. And again, there was, and the continent was completely devastated. And I think that's, in a way, actually, part of the Trumpian delusion is always that he gets to control all events and other people don't have agency. And he continually keeps on discovering that other people do have agency, and they don't necessarily fall in line. Witness the extension of the tariff negotiations with China. And finally, I think it kind of misunderstands him as this guy who thinks that he can make a whole bunch of big deals, the result of which he gets the Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, I mean, Charlie Sykes is right in one way that this is much more juvenile than anybody thinks. I'll say one other thing, which is, my European swing, and I think I reported this back to you when I came back. I was struck by the extent to which the Europeans quietly, not always as in as coherent a way as you would like, have been making preparations for how you keep Ukraine going, even if the Americans are not cooperative. And that even is, by the way, that's even on things like overhead reconnaissance, about space-based imaging. Not, they don't have our overhead constellation and so on. So I'm not going to despair yet, but I'm worried. Sure.
So, with just one final comment, and then we do need to go on to happier things, and you've prefigured it by your comment about Putin being a Moscow hood, as they say in the thrillers, because we're going to move on to talk about summer reading and thrillers. But this is, I think, there are overtones of Munich here, in the sense that, as with Munich, at least for the moment, Ukrainians are not meant to be in Alaska, although that's one of the points that the Europeans have made, which is that Zelensky should be there. And the White House, at least notionally, is saying that, they're considering that still, so that it's possible that might happen yet. And I hope it does. The other, of course, is the idea of, making, a diktat that's out there, a potential diktat about territory, as the French and the British, to be specific, did with the Czechs, at Munich. But you're right, in a lot of ways, it's much more like the Finnish Winter War. And I don't just say that because I'm a former U.S. ambassador to Finland, but because of the fighting, because of the ability of a smaller nation to hold off a larger one and force them essentially, to have to negotiate because they can't win the war. It is a little bit more like Finland. And in that sense, it's not just fortuitous that President Stubb of Finland was the one who delivered the message to Trump, because he has articulated, I think, a very important way of thinking about, about this. He's made the point that what mattered for Finland in 1940 was to maintain its sovereignty, to maintain its democracy, and to be willing to trade off territory in order, to maintain the first two. And that may be where we end up, as unfortunate as that is, in the real world. And, Finland remained sovereign, and it remained a democracy, albeit a very imperfect one because of its precipitous situation as a next door neighbor of the Soviet Union. But it remained the only country in Europe that bordered the Soviet Union that remained independent of Soviet control, and to which the Soviets returned territory in 1955, 10 years after the war ended. So there you have it. Let's move on to our summer reading. I know we've talked a little bit about this before, but I'll let you start.
So, well, like you, I find myself reading, having more books, which I'm kind of in the middle of, than I can possibly finish, and kind of looking hungrily at more. Um, Maybe we can go two at a time for books. Maybe let's start with books that we've read, and then books that we're in the middle of reading or that we hope to read. So I went back to one of my old favorites from when I was in high school, Rider Haggard's She. So this is She Who Must Be Obeyed. Rider Haggard wrote these an enormous number of sort of adventure novels, mainly set in Africa. He gets a bad rap as a British imperialist writer. Actually, the novels that he writes, some of them, there's one where the protagonist is a Zulu, and the characters are actually a little bit more complicated. But She is this terrific roller coaster of a novel which starts in London, and you go to Africa, and there's this Egyptian princess, who's been able to survive for a couple thousand years, and she's in love with this reincarnation of her Greek lover, and it's just a rattling good tale, and it's motivated me to want to read more of that. The other book, which I finished recently, which is nonfiction, but maybe there's a reason why I was reading them simultaneously. There's a historian of ancient Egypt named Toby Wilkinson, who wrote a marvelous book about the history of Egyptology, which is fascinating. How do the various European powers, get their hands on Egyptian artifacts, but then sort of
I think loot Egyptian artifacts is the verb you were looking for.
Well, loot, but also preserve. I mean,
Right.
this is, and Wilkinson, to his credit, captures that it wasn't that the Egyptians were carefully preserving their past. They were using this stuff as building material.
True.
So there's that. But then, he then traces how, as Egyptian national consciousness evolves, they very much want to preserve their heritage and claw it back. But he wrote a book called The Rise and Fall of Ancient Egypt, which is this history of Egypt, which goes back thousands and thousands of years, of 30 different dynasties. And I think the biggest thing there are many things that struck me about it, but one of the things that struck me about it was the degree of interaction between ancient Egypt and other ancient civilizations. And I would even extend that a bit, because I've also been reading a bit about the history of Iran. I think we sometimes underestimate the extent to which there was an enormous amount of cultural exchange between the Near East and, going back to our discussion with Fred Starr, what we think of as Central Asia, Iran, India, China. There is a lot of stuff going back and forth. I think William Dalrymple, if I'm not mistaken, has just written a book about trade routes in the Indian Ocean and the extent to which there's this kind of larger Indian sphere of influence. And I just find it fascinating that at a time when, obviously travel was extremely difficult, that you had a lot of that. Last book I'll mention, which I'm in the middle of reading, then we can talk about more. I want to hear yours, is the New York Review of Books put out a collection of Henry James book reviews. And he was a marvelous reviewer, although I forget who was another famous writer who said he was a guy who observed the world through a window. I mean, there's always something a little bit detached, but he knew everybody. He knew all not all, but almost all of the 19th century greats. Turgenev, Flaubert. I mean, the Brits, the Americans, and very, very penetrating. And it reminded me that when I'm in the mood to read serious fiction, which I'm not right at the moment, it's to the 19th century that I always go back.
Well, my tastes are a great deal more middle brow. I'm sorry. But as I mentioned, I finished off one of Daniel Silva's earlier Gabriel Allon books, The Black Widow, which is really quite scary and good. And I'm now reading his current this summer's sort of edition, which is an inside job. I know you've at least purchased one Gabriel Allon book. I think you'll really like
I
it.
haven't read it yet.
I think you'll really like it because I know you are a devotee of Sir Ian Pears, and Gabriel Allon, in addition to being accomplished assassin and retired now head of Israeli intelligence, also is an art restorer, and so at post-retirement, this is a mystery set in the art world, and a potential recovery of a lost painting by a Renaissance master. And I will not go further lest I, spoil the book. But like all of the Silva books, it's extremely well plotted and very snappy dialogue and lots of fun.
On your recommendation, I ordered the first in the series. It hasn't arrived yet, but
yeah, it's a lot of fun. I want to talk too about other thrillers. So I mean, we ought to spend some time on thrillers because both you and I think enjoy reading them. So I'm hoping this summer to get to one of the additional volumes of the series by Mick Herron called Slow House.
Yes.
Or Slow Horses, actually. The first book is Slow Horses, which I have read. It's also been turned into an Apple TV series, which I haven't seen, but people tell me is quite good. It's great because it makes the point that in every profession, there are those that are not that gifted, and there's always someone who graduated. People always say there's some doctor or dentist who graduated last in their class. You don't want to have them as your.
The joke is always, do you know what they call the person who graduated last in his class? Doctor.
Right. Exactly. So this is slow performers, who are called slow horses, actually, who are not quite up to snuff or have screwed up in some way in His Majesty's Secret Service, and are therefore relegated to a backwater office, which has the improbable name of Slough House, SLOUGH. And it's really the first one, Slow Horses, is really great fun. Looking forward. I think Dead Lions is the next one, and I'm hoping to read that.
Yeah, I've heard wonderful things about those. I haven't read them yet. I do have two thrillers which I'm hoping to take with me. We're going to head into the mountains for a few days. One is by a Brit named Charles Beaumont.
Ah, yes, I've
called
heard.
A Spy Alone, which is, saying it's not fair that you had the Cambridge Five. Maybe there was a secret Soviet spy ring at Oxford too, and and he's a former British spook. The other is by, and you may have read this one, David McCloskey, Damascus Station.
I haven't read either. I've heard great things by both of them. I think he's a former CIA person.
Yeah. There are a number of these former agency people now who've written these, some of which are pretty good. My wife read Stella Remington's first. She just passed. First female head of MI5, I think, and said that one was pretty good. We're both John le Carré fans, kinda. So you want to say something about John le Carré?
Well, yeah, let's talk about le Carré. But let me, before you leave Stella Remington, Judy's got, of course, impeccable taste. I mean, I've read a couple of the Liz Carlyle novels that she's written. That past tense now. She did just pass. They're really quite good, I thought, and they're particularly good on the byplay between MI5 and MI6 and the interactions between the two. So I've really, I think I've read two or three. I've read Illegal Action and Riptide, and I think one other. in that series. She's also, just before she passed, had written 2 novels that are about a CIA agent, about an American agent, which I haven't read, but it really was a shame that she passed. I mean, she really, I think there are about maybe 8, 9, maybe 10 of the Liz Carlisle novels, and
Really, I didn't know she had written that many.
yeah, no, it's quite a series. It's like Mick Herron, they're quite a good series. Well, on Le Carré, so I met him once, very
Oh,
briefly.
really? What was that like?
Very, very briefly. So his half brother, Rupert Cornwall, was the independent correspondent in Moscow while Trish and I were serving in Moscow. And he came to visit. The tail end of the Cold War. It was Glasnost and Perestroika. And he came, it was a chance encounter. It was extremely brief. And like a lot of encounters of that kind, you come away kind of sort of, is that all there is there, really? I mean, I don't know. It was very unprepossessing, and it was in that sense a little disappointing. But I mean, I do think that the 3, the George Smiley novels, particularly the 3 so-called Carla novels, Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy, Smiley's,
Honorable Schoolboy,
and
Smiley's People.
Those are really, I think incredibly good. I mean, Tinker Tailor might be my nominee for, one of the best spy novels I've ever read. But I do think as time went on, he became, well, first of all, the Cold War ended. And so the framework of much of what he was writing about kind of went away. And I think, like a lot of thriller writers, sort of post-Cold War, there was a kind of, loss of, what do you write about? I mean, I remember reading Single and Single, and so, it was international, business shenanigans and things like that. By the early 2000s, I think he was gripped by kind of a deep-seated, coruscating kind of anti-Americanism. I mean, I found Absolute Friends, which was published, a couple of years after the Iraq War started, almost unreadable. I mean, because it was just so, just suffused with anti-Americanism. I mean, I did read about a year ago, A Legacy of Spies, which is one, I think, his third to last work before he passed. And that was a kind of return, in a way, to what he wrote, in the 70s when he was writing the Carla novels. It is a relook by a accountability review board, and it's not called that, but I mean that's essentially what it was, of an early case that someone was involved in the 1980s, in which someone ended up being killed, and the question was, in retrospect, was this agent responsible for the death of a source, essentially? And it's shot through again with a lot of the moral ambiguity of, like, well, what's the right standard, to judge this? And is it possible for people that many years after the fact to really be able to make a judgment about what the agent was doing in the midst of, pretty stressful set of situations? And it I think was a return to form, I would say. So it makes me want to read Running Agents in the Field, which is his next to last book.
So I confess I haven't sort of mastered the whole of the oeuvre. I have The Perfect Spy, which is supposed to be one of his best, which is apparently really an account of his father, who was this incredible swindler, sociopath, who he writes about quite openly. I read his son wrote a prequel to the Carla trilogy, which I thought was quite serviceable. I mean, I thought it was quite good. I agree with you. The Carla trilogy is marvelous. Although I will say, there's always been a part of me which thinks moral ambiguity in the Cold War. Well, I understand that there's some, of course, because there's moral ambiguity in human affairs, but they really were the bad guys, and
Right.
we really were the good guys. And there's just so much gray that you can slop all over the portrait. I am just one parenthetic note. You mentioned the really corrosive anti-Americanism. That is an occasional theme with British writing. I was taken aback by a piece by somebody I know, Max Hastings, a very distinguished military historian, former editor of the Telegraph, I think former editor of the Spectator too. The column in the Spectator, which is just dripping hatred of the United States. And the Brits periodically do that. And I think the connection here is, Britain is still, there's a part of Britain, or a part of the British, I don't know, official class or upper class or something, which is still wrestling with not only with the loss of empire, but sort of ceding Britain's place in the world to the United States. Now, the part of what makes the Carlyle trilogy good is there's a particular moment, I think, where Connie, who's the expert on Russia, is sort of condoling with George Smiley, this sad retired agent, about, you poor boys, you were brought up to run an empire, and instead you're, in this kind of declining middle power. But it is, it's part of the British landscape. It's by the way, I'd drop for a moment back into seriousness before we go back to books to read. I think it's one of the reasons why when people say, okay, the United States has completely lost its moral standing. Well, as far as a lot of people we know are concerned, we never had it, rightly or wrongly, and we should not get too upset about it. One last thing. Have you ever read the Somerset Maugham Ashendon series? Those are wonderful. Somerset Maugham, who was a fantastic short story writer, wrote some novels too, but his short stories, I think, are just fabulous. Served in MI6 during World War One, and a lot of this is thinly autobiographical. And talk about the moral ambiguity part. He actually speaks to that in a war which was morally more ambiguous. And I think he really actually set the model for a lot of succeeding writers, where these weren't just thrillers; they were also psychological studies. I don't know about you, Eric. I find I'm doing more rereading. I'm still reading lots of new things, but I have yet to reread things. I would like to reread the Carlyle trilogy, which I haven't looked at in decades and decades.
It's funny you say that, because I am just the opposite. I am just the opposite, and the reason is, I think about this. It might be because I'm a few years older than you. I feel the sands of the grains of sand of time slipping through the hourglass, and so there's so much that I want to read, that the idea of going back and rereading things seems like a luxury I don't feel I have.
Well, but consider the possibility that, the Archangel Gabriel would say, why were you wasting all your time with that new crap?
Yeah, there's that. No, there is that. Another kind of thrillery, kind of not a spy fiction, but good old mysteries. Again, maybe because I spent time in Finland with my family. There's a whole genre of Nordic noir, which I find very, very attractive.
Really, maybe it's because this, I want to escape. And I like the cozy murder mysteries where, the person who got schwacked, they deserve to get schwacked. They'll get caught in the end. There'll be humorous byplay between the detective and his sidekick, and all that. But, okay, explain to me the appeal of Nordic noir.
So Jo Nesbø, who is a Norwegian writer, who, by the way, is the co-creator of absolutely fabulous Franco-Norwegian series called Occupied, uh,
Oh
which
yes,
is
I have
which is
I had nightmares about that one.
yeah, which is on Netflix, and I commend to our viewers and listeners. It's about a Russian occupation of Norway. I mean, it's all actually very close to the bone right now. Um, but he also has written a series of thrillers about an Oslo police detective, Harry Hole, who has. I mean, it's kind of grim, kind of reading, but it's propulsive. I mean, because it's very well plotted psychological mysteries about killers, and he's great. I've read The Redeemer and Nemesis and a couple of others, but he's got a whole series about 10, 12, and I've read he's written some novels not about Harry Hole, but other kind of criminal activity in the high north, and I commend that. And then I want to read Keeper of Lost Causes by UC Adler Olsen, who is a Dane. And what tripped me onto that is, again, a Netflix series, which is Department Q, which is
Oh, yeah.
it's set. So the Adler Olsen novels are set in Denmark. The TV series transfers them
Goes to
to
Scotland,
Scotland.
doesn't it? Yeah.
Yes, they're set in Scotland, but I gather the plot is pretty similar, which is a detective who's been uh, shot and wounded at a murder scene by the killer. Um, Comes back to his job, and because he's kind of been on sort of uh, psychological leave, PTSD leave for a while. He comes back and they put him in charge of a department of cold cases, in the hope that he'll just, sit in the basement where they put him and leave well enough alone. But of course he doesn't.
Yeah.
So that's a great series, as well. I mean, I think there are 10 of those. And I don't know if there's going to be another season of Department Q. The first season was very frightening, very chilling, and creepy, but very good. And so I'm looking forward to reading the book and actually maybe the whole series. And I'm hoping that the television version continues. And then I've got a number of books by Dan Fesperman, who is the author of. He's a former Baltimore Sun correspondent, foreign correspondent. He's written a whole series of thrillers: Prisoner of Guantanamo, The Warlord's Son. I read Layover in Dubai, which I read it on an airplane, and I couldn't put it down. It was like, again, one of these very propulsive thrillers about a guy who goes to Dubai on a layover and has got some business to do there, and it ends up being caught up in all sorts of crazy shenanigans. But he also has written about drones. He's written a book called Unmanned, which I'm looking forward to reading. So lots of good diversion out there, because otherwise we'd have to spend all our time dealing with the jackasses.
Well, there's that. I will confess, I occasionally like to dabble in horror fiction, and particularly from the high British period. There's a book by a man named Adrian Ross, which is supposed to be terrific, called The Whole of the Pit, which takes place during the English Civil War, and it involves, the horror that lurks in some pit. But then I will confess, and maybe this will kind of wrap up. I've been reading a little bit of nonfiction too. I think I mentioned this wonderful book, Winston's Bandits, which is about round church. It was quite good. But maybe we should wrap up with books we want to read. I mean, I'm taking notes on your recommendations, and I will follow through. I want to go back to Christopher Lasch and read The Culture of Narcissism. A number of people have
Great
said
book.
that he's really kind of captures our world. And then here's and this will be completely cranky.
Christopher Lasch. I mean, culture narcissism is great.
Betrayal of the Elites. Or Treason of the Elites, something
Yeah,
like that.
he's got several books that he wrote in his last years. He was a very penetrating guy. I actually taught culture of narcissism in my last semester of teaching at Yale before I joined the Foreign Service.
Oh wow, okay. Yeah, I've heard that it helps explain the present discontents. But I'll tell you what I'm really enjoying. Irving Chernev, who was Ukrainian who came to the United States in the thing after World War II, logical chess move by move. And what it is he was a very prolific chess author. That's just 33 great chess games where he walks you through, here's what each guy is thinking as they make each move. And the thing that I particularly like about it is, are you a chess player by any chance?
I'm not.
Okay.
I mean, I've played chess, but I'm not
So you may
I'm not any good at it.
Have you ever seen chess notation?
Yeah.
Okay, so as you probably know, sometime in the middle of the really last third of the 20th century, part of the kind of general decay of Western civilization is people adopted algebraic notation, where the board is divided, 1 through 8 and A through H, and it is soulless and empty and meaningless. And Chernev's books were all written before that. So he uses descriptive notation. So if it's pawn to king 4, it's, by golly, it's P-K4, and it's like real pieces. And I think that actually part of the decline of our civilization really dates to the adoption of algebraic notation, where you're abstracting from real humanity. And I read.
Won't get the argument from me.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm the same way. When I see somebody screaming on the streets, I usually steer around them. But the last thing I'll say, sort of seriously, that Chernev is a wonderful writer, and he's a very engaging writer, and he kind of pulls you into that world. And I think one of the reasons why we like these thrillers and sometimes escapist fiction is that you want to be pulled into a different world than the one that you're in. And to some extent, with the right kind of chess author, you can find that as well.
Any way you can get it to be pulled out of the current reality seems to me to be worthwhile.
Amen to that.
Well, we, you and I both actually, because we co-host a show that involves authors. A lot of the time, we have a long, right, required reading list that we have to maintain. But I will say that I'm so enjoying Tim Bovary's Allies at War, and we hope to have him on in early September. But his book is so terrific that I'm actually looking forward to going back and reading his earlier book on appeasement. Which
I've heard that that's very good. No, look, one of the perks of this podcast is we get to read some great books, and unlike a lot of hapless reviewers, we don't have to review any duds if we don't want to.
There you go. So yeah, I mean that's certainly on my list. A while ago I was doing a lot of reading on the 1840s and 50s, and I want to go back to that because, as point you were making earlier in the show about how the Civil War is still very much alive in the United States. Sadly, I think that's true, and it's both the run up to the Civil War, I think, is very important to understand, and as you pointed out, the post-war period, which I spent some part of my misspent youth in graduate school studying. Is equally important. The period of so-called redemption of the South, from the alleged ravages, rapine and brigandage of Reconstruction, which was not the case at all, but is part of the myth.
Yeah, and of course that period attracted magnificent historians. People like David Potter and
C. Vann Woodward.
I mean, it's a very, very long list. There's actually one other book which I just got. I think it's called The Undiscovered Country, which is a history of the American West, by somebody who I think has been the head of the American Western History Association. I'm blocking on the name right now, which just came out, which has been getting terrific reviews. So lots of stuff to read and not nearly enough time to read it all.
Agreed. Well, we'll be back next week with something new and different. We'll be talking about Latin America, which is an important part of the world that we have, I think, both concluded that we have unfairly neglected, but we will remedy that next week.
Yep. Look forward to it.